Magruder's American Government, Chapter 4, Federalism, Section 2, The National Government and the 50 States. Have you ever really focused on the words United States and what those two words say? The United States is a union of states, the several states joined together, the states united. The framers of the Constitution created the Union of States, and they intended to preserve it. To that end, the Constitution 1 requires the national government to guarantee certain things to the states, and 2 makes it possible for the national government to do certain things for the states. The nation's obligation. The Constitution places several obligations on the national government for the benefit of the states. Most of them are found in Article 4, Republican form of government. The Constitution requires the national government to guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. The Constitution does not define Republican form of government, and the Supreme Court has regularly refused to do so. The term is generally understood to mean a representative government. The Supreme Court has held that the question of whether a state has a republican form of government is a political question. That is, it is one to be decided by the political branches of the government, the President and Congress, and not by the courts. The only extensive use ever made of the Republican form guarantee came in the years immediately following the Civil War. Congress declared that several southern states did not have governments of a Republican form, and refused to admit senators and representatives from those states until they had ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and broadened their laws to recognize the voting rights and other rights of African Americans. Invasion and internal disorder. The Constitution states that the national government must also protect each of them, the states, against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. Article 4, Section 4. Today, it is clear that an invasion of any one of the states would be met as an attack on the United States itself. This constitutional guarantee is therefore now of little significance. That was not the case in the late 1780s. Then it was not at all certain that all 13 states would stand together if a foreign power attacked one of them. So, before the states agreed to give up their war-making powers, each demanded that an attack on any one of the states would be met as an attack on all of them. The federal system assumes that each of the 50 states will keep the peace within its own borders. Thus, the primary responsibility for curbing insurrection, riot, or other internal disorder rests with the individual states. However, the Constitution does recognize that a state might not be able to control some situations. It therefore guarantees protection against internal disorder, or what the Constitution calls domestic violence. The use of federal force to restore order within a state has been a rare event historically. Several instances did occur in the 1960s, however. When racial unrest exploded into violence in Detroit during the long, hot summer of 1967, President Lyndon Johnson ordered units of the United States Army into the city. He acted at the request of the governor of Michigan, George Romney, and only after Detroit's police and firefighters, supported by state police and National Guard units, could not control the riots, arson, and looting in the city. In 1968, again at the request of the governors involved, federal troops were sent into Chicago and Baltimore to help put down the violence that erupted following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1992, President George H.W. Bush ordered members of the National Guard, the Army, and the Marines to Los Angeles to restore order after 3 days of rioting. The violence was sparked by the acquittal of 4 white officers charged with the beating of Rodney King, a black motorist, after he led them on a high-speed chase. Normally, a president has sent troops into a state only in answer to a request from its governor or legislature. If national laws are being broken, national functions interfered with, or national property endangered, however, a president does not need to wait for such a plea. The ravages of nature, storms, floods, drought, forest fires, and the like, can be far more destructive than human violence. Here, too, acting to protect the states against domestic violence, the federal government stands ready to aid stricken areas. Respect for territorial integrity. The national government is constitutionally bound to respect the territorial integrity of each of the states. That is, the national government must recognize the legal existence and the physical boundaries of each state. The basic scheme of the Constitution imposes this obligation. Several of its provisions do so as well. For example, Congress must include, in both its houses, members chosen in each one of the states. Recall, too, that Article 5 of the Constitution declares that no state can be deprived of its equal representation in the United States Senate without its own consent. Admitting new states. New states would soon join the original 13 as members of the new United States was generally accepted as fact in the 1780s. To that end, the Congress of the Confederation, meeting as the framers were drafting what was to become the Constitution, enacted the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Clearly the most important measure passed by that body in its 8 years as the government of the United States. The ordinance anticipated the creation of new states in what was then known as the Northwest Territory, a roughly defined area lying north of the Ohio River and west of New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. The measure provided for the eventual statehood of any sector of that region that acquired a population of at least 60,000 persons. It made provision for local self-government, for civil and political rights, and for the support of education. An earlier measure, the Ordinance of 1785, had created the township system for the dividing of land for the support of local schools. Its provisions were folded into the 1787 enactment. The Northwest Ordinance was readopted by the new Congress under the Constitution in 1790, and it served as the basis for later legislation regarding the nation's territorial possessions. It established that those territories were not to be kept in a second-class status, but were to be groomed for statehood on an equal footing with the existing states. Congress and new states. Only Congress has the power to admit new states to the Union, and the Constitution places only one restriction on that power. A new state cannot be created by taking territory from one or more of the existing states without the consent of the legislature of the state involved. Congress has admitted 37 states since the original 13 formed the Union. As the map on page 105 shows, 4 states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maine, and West Virginia, were created from parts of already existing states. Texas and Vermont were independent republics before admission. California was admitted shortly after being ceded to the United States by Mexico. Each of the other 30 states entered the Union only after a longer period of time, frequently more than 15 years, as an organized territory. Admission procedure. The process of admission to the Union is usually simple. The area desiring statehood first asks Congress for admission. If and when Congress chooses, it passes an enabling act, an act directing the people of the territory to frame a proposed state constitution. A territorial convention prepares the Constitution, which is then put to a popular vote in the proposed state. If the voters approve the document, it is submitted to Congress for its consideration. If Congress still agrees to statehood after reviewing the proposed Constitution, it passes an Act of Admission, an act creating the new state. If the President signs the act, the new state enters the Union. The two newest states, Alaska and Hawaii, shortened the usual admissions process. Each adopted a proposed constitution without waiting for an enabling act, Hawaii in 1950 and Alaska in 1956. Both became states in 1959. Conditions for admission. Before finally admitting a new state, Congress has often set certain conditions. For example, in 1896, Utah was admitted on condition that its constitution outlawed polygamy, the practice of having more than one spouse at a time. In admitting Alaska to the Union, Congress forever prohibited that state from claiming title to any lands legally held by any Native American. Each state enters the Union on an equal footing with each of the other states. Thus, although Congress can set certain conditions, like those just described, it cannot impose conditions of a political nature. For example, when Oklahoma was admitted to the Union in 1907, Congress said that the state could not move its capital from Guthrie to any other place before 1913. In 1910, however, the Oklahoma legislature moved the state's capital to Oklahoma City. When that step was challenged, the Supreme Court held, in Coyle v. Smith, 1911, that Congress can set conditions for a prospective state's admission, but those conditions cannot be enforced if they compromise the independence of a state to manage its own internal affairs. Consider one more example. President William Howard Taft vetoed a resolution to admit Arizona to the Union in 1911. He did so because Arizona's proposed constitution provided that members of the state's judiciary could be removed from office, by popular vote. This provision meant, said Taft, that in deciding cases, a judge would have to keep one eye on the law and the other on public opinion. In response to the president's concern, Arizona removed the recall section from the document. In 1912, Congress passed and the president signed another act of admission for Arizona. Almost immediately after admission, however, the new state amended its new constitution to provide for the recall of judges. That provision remains a valid part of Arizona's constitution today. Cooperative federalism. Remember, federalism produces a dual system of government, one in which the two basic levels operate over the same people and the same territory at the same time. As a result of this complex arrangement, competition, tensions, and conflict are a regular and ongoing part of American federalism. In short, the American federal system is much like a tug of war, a continuing power struggle between the national government and the states. The American federal system also involves a broad area of shared powers. That is, in addition to the two separate spheres of power held and exercised by the two basic levels of government, there are large and growing areas of cooperation between them. Federal grants and aid. Perhaps the best-known examples of this intergovernmental cooperation are the many federal grants in aid programs, grants of federal money or other resources to the states and their cities, counties, and other local units. Many of these governments are regularly strapped for funds. These grants often help them perform a large share of their everyday functions. The history of grants and aid programs goes back more than 200 years, to the period before the Constitution. In the Northwest Ordinance, the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, provided for the government of the territory beyond the Ohio River and set aside sections of land for the support of public education in those future states. On through the 19th century, most states received grants of federal lands for a number of purposes: schools and colleges, roads and canals, flood control work, and several others. A large number of the major state universities, for example, were founded as land-grant colleges. These schools were built with the money that came from the sale of public lands given to the states by the Morrill Act of 1862. Congress began to make grants of federal money quite early, too. In 1808, it gave the states $200,000 to support the militia, the forerunner of the present-day National Guard. Cash grants did not play a large role, however, until the Depression years of the 1930s. Many of the New Deal programs aimed at bringing the nation out of its economic crisis were built around grants of money. Since then, Congress has set up hundreds of grants in aid programs. In fact, more than 500 are now in operation. Dozens of programs function in a variety of areas in education, mass transit, highway construction, healthcare, and many others. Grants and aid are based on the national government taxing power. The Constitution gives Congress that power in order to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Today, these grants total about $400 billion and account for about a third of all state and local government spending each year. In effect, grants and aid blur the division of powers line in the federal system. They make it possible for the federal government to operate in many policy areas in which it would otherwise have no constitutional authority. For example, in such fields as education, low-income housing, local law enforcement, and mental health. Critics of grants and aid have long made this point. They also argue that the grants, which usually come with strings attached, often give Washington a major, and they say an unwarranted, voice in the making of public policy at the state and local levels. Types of federal grants. Today, Congress appropriates money for three types of grants in aid: categorical grants, block grants, and project grants. Over time, most grants have been categorical. Categorical grants are made for some specific, closely defined purpose, for school lunches, or for the construction of airports or wastewater treatment plants, for example. Categorical grants are usually made with conditions attached. These strings require the state to 1. Use the federal monies only for the specific purpose involved, 2. Make its own monetary contribution, often a matching amount, but sometimes much less, 3. Provide an agency to administer the grant, and 4. Obey a set of guidelines tailored to the particular purpose for which the monies are given. Block grants, which have come into wide use over the last several years, they are made for much more broadly defined purposes than are categorical grants, for health care, social services, or welfare, for example. They are also made with fewer strings attached, so state and local governments have greater freedom in deciding just how and on what to spend block grant dollars. From the 1980s on, many programs once supported by separate and fragmented categorical grants have been merged into broader block grants. Congress also provides money for project grants. These are grants made to states, localities, and sometimes private agencies that apply for the grants. The Department of Health and Human Services makes many project grants. Through its National Institutes of Health, for example, to support scientists engaged in research on cancer, diabetes, neurological disease, and other medical issues. Many state and local governments also apply for these grants to fund their job training and employment programs. Other forms of federal aid. The national government aids the states in several other important ways. For example, the FBI gives extensive help to state and local police. The Army and Air Force equip and train each state's National Guard units. The Census Bureau's data are essential to state and local school, housing, and transportation officials as they plan for the future. Many other forms of aid are not nearly so visible. Lulu payments, for example, are federal monies that go to local governments in those areas in which there are large federal landholdings. These direct payments are made in lieu of, to take the place of, the property taxes that those local governments cannot collect from the national government. These payments are also known as PILTs, payments in lieu of taxes. State aid to the national government. Intergovernmental cooperation is a two-way street. That is, the state and their local governments also aid the national government in many ways. Thus, state and local election officials conduct national elections. These elections are financed with state and local funds, and they are regulated largely by the state laws. The legal process by which aliens can become citizens, called naturalization, takes place most often in state courts. The examples go on and on.